Hi, I'm Madison from Jewish Psychedelic Summit, and we have Ido Hartogsohn and Itamar Zadoff. Ido is an Israeli scholar, artist, and activist in the field of psychedelics. His work focuses on the role of collective set and setting in shaping psychedelic experiences for human cultures. His book, American Trip, Set and Setting and the Psychedelic Experience in the 20th Century, appeared with MIT Press. Itamar is a PhD candidate of Haifa University that researches with research topics being the psychedelic communities in Israel and Japan and their cultural footprint. So I'm really excited that you're both here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, I've known Ido. I think I interviewed you way back when for Double Blind. Itamar, it's, anyone who Ido says should be in this interview. I really feel lucky to have you both here to answer these questions. So to start, the question is, why study the history of Israeli psychedelia? Like, why do we care about the Israeli version of psychedelia? And isn't this a universal experience? So.
Right, yeah, well, I think the classic idea about psychedelics is that they create or elicit this universal experience of oneness of all people and beyond race and nationality. And that's true in many ways. But there's also some aspects that don't get captured in this kind of description. And, one of the most prominent aspects of psychedelic culture, therapy, science is the whole issue of sense setting and how context shapes experiences with psychedelics. So sense setting, and something that I've been working on in recent years, is the idea that sense setting as a collective idea, as a collective apparatus that shapes psychedelic experiences, not just for individuals, but for entire societies. And so in that sense, and, getting back to my recent book, American Trip, which I'm currently following up on with Itamar, who's writing. And I should already perhaps say that one of the reasons we're having this conversation is because of this whole project that we're working on. Itamar is writing his PhD on psychedelic culture in Israel and Japan. I'll let him speak some more about that in a sec. But so that's kind of a continuation, and we're writing about the history of Israeli psychedelia. So it's kind of a continuation of this effort of thinking about psychedelia in terms of global cultures and there are very specific qualities and properties. So continuing on and building on this realization that, for example, a lot of what we consider the psychedelic experience in the today is actually some kind of reflection of the 1960s American experience and the politics, the culture of the 1960s, which is something that I speak to in American Trip. So it becomes interesting to think about the Israeli experience, psychedelic experience and psychedelic culture in the same way, and how it differs from other places in the world, and kind of gives us perspective about this culture here. Why does Israeli psychedelic culture look the way it is? Why does it function the way it functions? And maybe also get a perspective on Israeli society and also on the psychedelic experience and the way that it might intermesh with different cultures and ideas.
It sounds like you're saying that a lot of the experience of a psychedelic is primed almost by our preconceived notions of it culturally.
Right, culture-driven, culturally framed, historically and socially framed. So yeah, definitely.
If I can add, I think the key word here is, as I see it, is what you call glocalization. It's like it is a universal phenomenon, but in the aspect of Israel and the little I found in Japan, that each story has its own color. And I think what is really, really beautiful in the psychedelia is that it manages to show that it manages to adapt to that specific set and setting and manages to produce something new in that particular context. That makes it very interesting. And I think that the Israeli one is important as much as the German story, or I don't know, the Slovakian story, or maybe, I don't know if there's other stories.
So I guess that leads us to our next question, which is what features distinguish Israeli psychedelic culture in Israel? So how is the flavor of Israeli psychedelia different?
This question, you can answer it in two aspects. I think that the first aspect is the historical context. If you look at the story of psychedelia in Israel, is a part of the PhD that I'm writing. Me and Ido are writing a chapter in the book that covers this history. And one of the interesting things that you can see with the psychedelia that it knows first how to enter, or how to, I don't know, if you look at it like as a chameleon effect, it also wrote in his book, it knows to put itself inside different cultural contexts, in the, I don't know, like the Zionist, Sabaric, Tel Aviv context, but also in the immigrant context, in the nature hippie context, even in the religious context. And it knows how to enter there and give a certain, I don't know, like another incentive, something that changes the color. But on the other hand, if you look at the Israeli psychedelia, it does carry a certain level of DNA from the place it came from. You can sense the 60s hippie movement that came with it, but it didn't dominate it. It just brought this like kind of odor with it, and then managed to enter and fertilize, I don't know if it's a good word for it, and the psychedelic culture in it. And another thing which is really interesting, that is something that like we discovered, like it's really, for me it's really exciting, because we really discovered the past 2 weeks, is that the narrative that was built in my head about how the psychedelic community in Israel managed to divide itself is not totally similar. A lot of things, like if you look about like the psychedelic trance parties and stuff like that, it did had a part in forming, for example, the ritual context of it. And another thing, that if you look now about what happens in the psychedelic community, which is it's now left fascinating. You have now the psychedelic community works like, I don't know, like a high-tech kind of company thing, that each member of it takes a certain role in the psychedelic activism. And you don't really have this manager on top that says you do this and you do that, but something like in a very, very harmonic and almost, it's almost hard to believe that nobody told anybody how to do it, but each one takes its own role and managed to create this truly amazing functioning psychedelic activist agenda in these days. And I think I'm not really familiar with other ones yet. I know in Japan it doesn't really exist. So if you compare it, it's like the Israeli activism is really, really well organized. But on the other hand, nobody actually said, like, managed to build, like, have this total look. It just happened by itself.
Right. So I completely want to second Itamar on that, and on the really amazing development that has happened here over the past decade, and the really incredible growth that that's been happening in the Israeli psychedelic community. And as Itamar said, it's like this kind of hive mind where things just, or very grassroots, where things just, people just pick up different aspects and different things that are in need of doing, whether it's in activism, in a safe zone kind of psychedelic first help, or kind of activism in parliament, or just community work between psychonaut support groups, and so many different aspects to that. I want to add also one of the things that I find interesting about the Israeli Israelis and psychedelia. Well, first of all, I my friends in Europe would always tell me that when they go to a trance party and they want to score some drugs, then they would say, "Where's the Israeli?" So I think there's this thing in Israeli culture of the karahana, basically, which is also kind of like the connection with Japan, if we connect it again to Itamar's PhD, because people say that the Israelis and the Japanese are the ones that are most, well, I should say that karahana, it's a Hebrew word well worth learning, and it means like basically, I don't know, how would you say, go berserk, basically, kind of like with the madness, but in a good way, like in a party. So there's a high level of intensity, I think, and of exploring. And I know a lot of what's happening in the conference has to do also with this relationship between Judaism and psychedelics, and maybe and the question why do we have so many Jews in the world of psychedelics, and maybe that has something to do with this spirit of exploration and of this seeking, truth seeking, and at the same time, it's also interesting to see that in most of the Western world, psychedelia is mostly associated with upper middle class, more privileged groups. And in Israel, it's not really like that. And also for this reason, the entire country basically is into psychedelics, not just people from, I don't know, that are better off, but also people that are, and not just people, that are liberal, but people also that are quite nationalist, also people that are religious or even Haredi, even ultra-Orthodox.
And
So
even
that creates a really
settlers,
interesting mixture. Yeah, you
and
were
even
saying?
settlers.
Right, yeah. So you have, for example, you have ayahuasca ceremonies in in the settlements, and you have, for example, and you have trance parties where you have soldiers that get there on the weekend and then resume the next day and go back to their units. So you have these kinds of relationships that kind of challenge some of the common perceptions about psychedelics and what they do, and kind of complicate also the narrative maybe of psychedelics make you liberal or whatever, because it's really here. I mean, the psychedelic community, the core psychedelic community, probably holds a lot to these values, but beyond the community, there's just a lot of people interested in psychedelics in many ways. Some of them are overlapping with the core community, or who knows what's a core community? I don't know, it's just many communities. But yeah, so I think that's a really interesting aspect of psychedelia in Israel.
What was the word that you used for berserk? Like the
Oh,
intent?
Karachana,
Karachana?
a good one. Yala Karachana.
Okay, I'm gonna remember that. It's definitely because
You definitely should.
it
Yeah,
brings me to something I've
keyword.
experienced before, like in Israel, partying with Israelis, and I think like I've done some journalism around the importance of trance music or like psytrance or that scene, and you have the phenomenon of Israelis who go to India, specifically Goa, and there's the whole trance scene there, and they bring back the culture. And I've also seen there's a really large psytrance community in upstate New York among Haredim, like kind of kids who grew up like Black Hat Orthodox. And I think a lot of it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the psytrance culture and part of the psychedelic culture and the intensity of that partying has a lot to do with just like processing the intensity of life, whether it's coming from a very orthodox background for these, kids who are in Brooklyn and go upstate, or, living in the intensity of Israel and being in the army and, all of the interesting paradoxes that exist
Right.
in Israel, with the secular and religious, or Jewish and Arab, or left wing and right wing, or whatever it may be. And I think that I mean, that to me, like, is really one of the, when I've experienced Israeli psychedelic culture vis-a-vis American or India or whatever, that is kind of the most significant aspect, I think. And maybe that comes also from like our own like pieces of Jewish trauma, and like the getting out, like kind of shaking out all of the what the body is holding.
Right. I remember the BBC had that show. It was called Israel's Next Drug Generation, about Israeli travelers in India. And, so you were talking about Jewish trauma, and, and these days you have Israeli-made trauma, and of course, from military life and from the general, people say a lot of times that half the people in Israel, they have post-trauma, or it's a whole society in this kind of situation in some ways. So yeah, there's a lot of really, I imagine, wanting to kind of break away from some of the things that kind of chain you or drag on you in the everyday life. Yeah.
How much is the narrative of the psychedelics in Israel related to partying versus like to more intentional healing, stuff like that?
If I can comment on that, I think that as much as we progress with the research, the more people I talk to, I think that this there's a differentiation between partying and ritual or healing is a lot more gray than we talk. We just had an interview the other day that the first ritual, the first ayahuasca ritual that was in Israel, was made by the guys who went to Goa. And like, there was a really funny anecdote that like the shaman had to go out from them and say, guys, stop doing chinums out there, come in, there's a ritual. So I think, and a lot of the times also you talk about with people about their experience, and I can talk about myself as I'm a big fan of psytrance. There's the different, like the party at a certain point is healing, and it a spiritual context. And also a lot of people, when they talk about rituals, they're intense, but people do it a lot because they like it. It's fun. It's a certain. It's also a medicine. But you hear a lot of people that says, "Yeah, I want to do it because it's a way for me of escapism and stuff, which are of course spiritually based." So I think that this dividing this context, it's a lot. As I know it in the Israeli context, it's a lot more gray. And also, not only that, a lot of the things that I heard with people in Israel, that they talk about a few trips or a few sessions as the process, and not necessarily just this one-time thing, which is, I think, as I see it in Israel at least, it's something which is, it's grayer and yeah.
Yeah, I want to second what you're saying, is that I do think partying and like just having fun, it can be so cathartic and healing, sometimes more so even than the times that I've sat in ayahuasca circle. I mean, it's all, the ayahuasca circles can be fun, but also I've experienced just as much healing through psytrance parties and things like that.
And especially the Israeli setting of this, like two speakers, small shade in the middle of the desert. It's not exactly a festival. It's something which is really, really intimate. And there's a point when you feel that the DJ is a shaman, and you bring, the sun up to get, like, there's something really ritualistic, I think, in the Israeli context, because it's not this big production of how it's like 50, 60, 200 people in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And another thing which is also interesting that we heard it, the first ayahuasca rituals were really similar to the way that people gathered to trance parties, that you had this rumor and you had the phone and you had to go somewhere in the forest, like something which is in the certain setting of the ritual or the party is amazingly similar.
For people who don't have the context for the secret nature of these parties, can you just explain, I mean, one time I went.
Okay, so like before smartphone times, you used to go in Tel Aviv. I'm from Jerusalem, so, and you used to see a graffiti somewhere with the name of the line of the people who do the party that you know. then you know something is coming up, and so you start asking friends, and then around, you know, something somewhere happens, and you have the date, and usually at 12 o'clock you call. And this is my time. I know in earlier time it was even more I don't know, secret, and you had this kind of voice message telling you go 2 hours south from Nitzanim, and then you go left, then you see this small pink ribbon, and then you go. You know, after 3 hours of getting lost in the middle of the desert, you open the window and start hearing the bass, and then you get to the promised land. You know.
Yeah, I've experienced similar in Goa. I guess it's, you know, maybe the part of the psytrance culture.
Yes. Yes.
So a couple more questions. Ido, was there anything you wanted to add before we move on? Okay. So could you, I'm going to switch up the last two, but for starters, how did psychedelics affect Israeli culture, both mainstream and underground?
It's interesting because a lot more than people are willing to admit. I would say that many of the mainstream, really how to say, admired and respected artists did do psychedelic drugs. It's hard to say have had until the 90s had a psychedelic agenda, but they were familiar. There's both, and it's funny because it's both of the Israeli culture inside of the, like the folk songs and the rock and roll, the Israeli rock and roll, the Israeli people heard, but also the art that Israel exported outside. For example, there's the first, I'll give you one anecdote, but the first Israeli film that was presented in a European cinema festival was by a guy whose name was Jacques Atmo, who had a very strong psychedelic agenda. I don't remember exactly, but I think the second movie he did after that movie, he was on tripping the whole set. You know, he was on LSD the whole filming time. That in like in the how to say in the really strong connection of psychedelic and art. Yona Volach is a very famous example for that. But also you can see that things that are in the psychedelic agenda did influence. For example, there's a really good book called Transmission that shows that how the trance parties became the way that people are getting married, that you don't have a wedding, you don't have a celebration without trance in it. And the point that you put the good stuff to the end, for example, it's something which is really inside the psychedelic agenda. And another thing which is also interesting in that aspect is that you can see the difference. For example, if you take trance, for example, which is, it's a mainstream, but it's not recognized by the authority. Everybody listens to everybody war in a trance party, more or less, but that didn't have the hug of the authorities of the society. So it definitely it is, you know, many artists, both in cinema, poets, musicians, and all that aspect, and a lot of this cultural products that were, I wouldn't say as with a strong relation, but did had effect or did had psychedelic drugs inside that context, did were the things that represented Israel in the world, and were later on one of the biggest and most important songs or creations inside the Israeli culture.
Ido, is there anything you want to add? Or?
Well, I'll just say that same as in the US, I think there's and everywhere else, there's so much to uncover, because for so many years this has been repressed and kind of like put in background, and even more so than in the States. And so really this project that Itamar is undertaking at the moment of doing really going after the the threads of the stories of Israeli psychedelia that are kind of, same as in the States. The 60s were already a while back, and we're starting to lose these. But over the past couple of months, Itamar has been speaking to so many of these, cultural figures, and just finding out that really when you dig a bit deeper, then you realize that it wasn't the state, and things got here later, and Israel was a lot more conservative than the states, but it did have very substantial um, impact on many cultural scenes here, and I think we're only scratching the surface. Yeah.
Cool. And so the next question is, can you pick out 3 to 5 key moments in the history of psychedelia in Israel?
I'm curious to know which one Ido pick. It's like,
Well, I have a couple of favorites. Maybe we'll go ping pong one by one.
okay.
So, well, I'll pick. There's this uh, there's this book called Masai LSD, LSD Trip, or LSD, but LSD Journey, by this well-known, very well-known, iconic Israeli poet, David Avidan. And he was always an experimental poet. He saw himself as quite psychedelic. He saw himself as an alien in the Middle East, uh, and and what he did in 1967, and he turned on together with the other poet friends at the time, and went on this journey, and always recording. He had his dictaphone, I think it was called at the time. So recording, and then produced this book that's really this kind of jam of Hebrew psychedelic writing from the 60s, because you definitely don't have a lot of these from that time, where it's very experimental. The whole book is just a depiction of the trip, and it has the parts where he's losing the dictaphone, he's losing the tape, and and the lines they go askew, and they kind of like it's completely expressionistic, and like a really nice expression of a way that this maybe LSD as an alien invading kind of like Tel Aviv in the 1960s, and the head of this Israeli poet at the time, and that's really kind of like opening up with that.
Well, wait, so where number were we at now?
That was the first one.
That was the first one.
Now Itamar needs to give a second one.
I have a one which I'm not sure it's like it's really is like as a recognized, but the first, as far as I found, the first documented LSD trip was in the 1960s in the mental hospital Talbia in Jerusalem. A professor, a psychiatrist named Kalsilovsky took a number of patients and a few curious students, and they bought some LSD from Sandoz, and they took all together, and he wrote an article, the first one I've managed to find anyway, which is called the Influences of LSD 25. And I think that's quite exciting. It's funny because it's not even psychedelic, it's psychomimetic, but it's the first documented, and that later it became an article in this medical journal, and there they wrote like the experiences and other stuff. Things is that was like the first for me.
When was that written?
In 1960.
Okay, cool.
Which
and
is like
Sandoz being, just so the audience knows,
Sandoz is the company that Albert Hoffman worked for, and if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, the biggest LSD manufacturer at that time. Or?
Sandoz, yeah. So Albert Hoffman, just so everyone knows, also is the person who was the first he synthesized LSD.
But it was fun to know, like we didn't manage to find it. There was a therapy, but there was this guy. Oh, we have LSD. Let's order some and see what it does, and write an article about it.
Right.
Yeah,
A really important part of that story, though, is that this doctor also gave LSD to another very major Israeli poet from the time, Yona Volach, and she had a very different experience from David Avidan. And we're still trying to figure out the story behind that, but it seems like she got a humongous amount, and at any rate, she later wrote this poem about, called in Hebrew something like "If you go on an LSD trip," and it became like this, basically, um, this caveat or this warning about the power of LSD to kind of, um, I don't know. Uh, get the threads of your mind kind of get them into knots. So that was that's also related to the whole Talabia story, and it's kind of like the other side and the more the more uh,
complicated.
dark aspect of LSD.
Even though she did do some more LSD later on with her friends.
Really, even though she warned everybody in that poem, yeah, don't do LSD.
Wow. So what was that? Go on.
No, I was about to give a third one because I think we must also mention Katzetnik, who was a Holocaust survivor and a very famous writer on the Holocaust. And in the 1980s, he shocked Israeli society after it was found out, and he was proud of that he underwent psychedelic therapy to treat his trauma from the Holocaust, from being a concentration camp prisoner, and then wrote this book, Sof en Adma, which tells the story of how through the mystical experiences of LSD he comes to forgive himself, forgive the Nazis is the right way to say it, but come to peace with everything and realize something higher, kind of like also he realizes in the book the identity between him and the Nazi tormentor, and the kind of like the unity of everything, and has these in the clinic these crazy mystical visions of seeing the smoke going out of the Auschwitz chambers and then seeing God in that smoke. So it's really it's a classic. It's a beautiful book. Not many people know it. I think not in Israel and definitely not outside of it. But I think it's one that definitely more people should know about, because it's just such a beautiful testament to the power of psychedelics to heal, and just this amazing story of this person that had this really difficult past, and that's an iconic figure in the history of the Holocaust in Israel. He was a witness for the persecution in the Eichmann case in 1961, and then bringing all of that together, that brings chills to my skin even now.
I just finished that book actually. It was really
Oh wow.
Yeah.
There's a very good half animation, like somebody took his trip report and made this kind of animation of it. So if somebody's
Really?
listening and interested and doesn't want to read the book, it's out there in the web. Just look for it.
It's an animation of Shviti.
They took the trip report. There's, I think it's a student work who took the trip report and made an animation of it.
Maybe you can add this to the show
notes. We can send it in the links later on, but there's a very strong scene there that he imagines himself as SS officer who yawns And then like it shows a lot of the humanity finding.
That was the one scene in the book that stood out to me the most, where he was just like identifying like this with this empathetic.
Yeah, they're humans. They're not. Yeah, so it's a very.
Yeah. That's funny. So that they animated the scene that really stands out to me. That's great. Do you guys have any others that you want to add? Or?
Yeah, I have another one, and that we jump to 98, what you call the new chance la trans. I can't say it's I don't know, probably it was, but it's like a common trip, because you had 50,000 people in Rabin Square in Tel Aviv and all over Israel, fighting for the right. I don't like the English word for it, but to rave, to party on. And that was like, I think, the first time that you managed to see the huge power of this movement, that people said enough, and we want to dance to our music and do the stuff we want. And it was overwhelming. I was a kid back there. I think I was in the second one, but to be in a place you have 50,000 people partying on in the middle of Israel, I think that was it's
50,000.
Only in Tel Aviv. You had a center in Jerusalem. You had, I think, one in Beersheba. So I don't know how many people, but yeah, like there was one, I think, 2 years ago, and it's
it was also very
experience.
big, very big, very powerful.
Great.
Wow. I think there's also something to be said about the collective psychedelic experience, especially when you have that type of energy. And again, the word you used, which I already forgot, the
Karachana.
And then you look there also that the people were not, if you had all the like here you talk about tribes, but you had everybody. You had the soldiers, I was there with my child, and you had people 50 and 60-year-old, and everybody was there because, and it's the first time that you can actually feel the power of the psychedelic movement in Israel. I think that's a crucial moment in the psychedelic history.
Wow. And remind me when that was again?
It was 1998.
Okay, cool.
The first one, and there was another one later. It's called No Chance, Give Trance a Chance.
I like that.
That's another, I think, a pivotal moment in that aspect.
So is there anything else you guys want to add or talk about, or just make sure it's a thorough interview?
And I think there's one more point that we just discovered. It's the first ayahuasca ritual that they brought a Brazilian shaman to Israel, who later gave ayahuasca, brought with him, and gave it to a few individuals, which they started, in fact, to spread this culture, which now is it's almost mainstream here. Everybody talks about it. It's a newspaper. It's flourishing.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, like, generally, if we're summing up that, I think Israel is people refer to it sometimes as a startup nation. It's also a PSYOP nation. Israelis tend to be an entrepreneurial and go and experiment, and I think that has a lot to do with the strength of the local psychedelic community and the fact that there's a lot of interest in these compounds, and there has been for many years. And it's been growing, and at the moment what's really exciting to see is how much this is also evolving beyond just getting high, which is also commendable in itself, but into something that's also very communal, that holds values, that has a lot of support. So it's really beautiful to see what's been happening over the past couple of years.
Well, thank you both for interviewing with me. I feel like I learned so much and good vocabulary. so yeah, people can find you, like, where can people find out about your work? Do you have like social media links that you want to talk about?
I have
You should read
those that
Ido's book. It's really good. It's really, really
yeah.
interesting.
Thank you, Ido. Thanks for saying that.
It's great.
American Dream, setting and the psychedelic experience in the 20th century. That's apart from that, I also founded this psychedelic video museum, the world's first psychedelic video museum. So that's definitely worth a visit, especially if you're in the right mood. And also, just for general writing on psychedelics in English, I'm giving my English links here. So I have this blog called psychedeliccultures.com. So psychedelic cultures, because there's not just one, there's a lot. So, so yeah, those are a couple of places.
Well, Itamar, you.
I don't have a psychedelic public persona yet. Just in the beginning of my.
This is it. This is your entree into your.
Yeah, this is the first time I'm out there. But yeah.
But next time you'll
Facebook,
have a
if you
bunch
want to
of
talk
them.
about it.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you both so much, and
Thank you.
I appreciate you being part of the GPS.